Hello, my name is Bob Heilbroner, and this is a video of the seventh class in an eighth class course that I'm teaching at the extension service of the local university. It's an OLLI class, and the class is called Living a Meaningful Life in Hard Times, in challenging times, and difficult times, hard times. And the subtitle is Belonging to Ourselves, Each Other, and the Planet. And the class today, and the overall view of the class, the overall structure of the class is the view that we are presently living in a paradigm of narcissism. And that's not only a matter of the psychopathology of Donald Trump or of the politics of fascism, but is also in the underlying aspects of our culture that make us vulnerable to Trumpism and fascism, and which is basically the assumptions and structures of advanced capitalism would be a way to describe oligopoly, multinational oligopoly, unrestrained capitalism would be the way to talk about it in the economic and political term for it. But but I'm saying that the basic assumptions in view of the narcissistic paradigm touch us in all the different realms of our life, in how we treat ourselves internally, how we treat other people, how we treat other nations, how we treat nature, and so forth. And that the paradigm, the narcissistic paradigm, which could be called imperialism or patriarchy, or depending on the realm you're talking about, is proving the blind sides of that paradigm are proving to be unsustainable and costly, and manifesting in things like war, genocide, species extinction, environmental destruction, conflict, economic inequality and oppression, and also on the psychological level, how we treat ourselves internally and how we treat other human beings and how we relate socially in our social structure. So the course is an exploration of that paradigm, but it's also an exploration but with the view that nature is telling us that this paradigm is unsustainable, and that when that happens, there's an opportunity to shift paradigms. But that shift doesn't happen all at once. The birth of paradigms have a life cycle and are born to flower, to be born, flower, deteriorate, and die, just as everything else on Earth is. And to give birth to the next thing, to give birth to a new paradigm. And that birth happens not in one piece, it happens gradually and ongoingly in the course of human beings living in and experiencing it comes out of people experiencing and trying to find ways to live well within that paradigm. But it comes out of people's experience with the blind spots and costs of the paradigm, but also with the broken promises of that paradigm. And so this has been happening all along, and I think that the progressive movements of the 60s and onwards have been part of building a new paradigm. And what we're experiencing now with Trumpism too, and the establishment support of fascism what we're experiencing now is a backlash to that and a attempt of the old system to claw its power back. And whether it succeeds or not will be up to how we respond to it. But today, this class is talking about, and I'm collapsing to what have been longer classes in the past, a class on evolution and a class on the evolution of pro-social behavior, the evolution of instincts that support pro-social behavior, and the evolution of the human brain. So the narcissistic system basic view of the world basically views the world as a contest for dominance between irreconcilable and opposing interests, us versus them, and in which a struggle and competition for dominance and survival, in which the options are to dominate or be dominated, in which case most of us would prefer to dominate. Maybe that's just my projection. But that view doesn't understand, is blind to the fact that there is a mutual interest in the whole, that there is a whole interest, that there is a mutual interest, that there is a shared interest. It doesn't see that. And so it's a point of view that does not honor or recognize a general interest, a shared interest that unites us and them, that unites all of us, which Native Americans called the concept of all our relations, that everything, including rivers and canyons, are our relations. So that system supports the top at the expense of the bottom or the ground, and wants us to identify with the top. It neglects the unity and connectedness and interdependence of things. It's blind to the utter dependence of the top on the ground, whether the ground is the human ground of the populace or the ground, working people, or whether the ground is nature. It is blind to it. That's where the expression, born on third base and thinks he hit a triple, takes privilege for granted, and therefore and adopts it as a quality of the self. So it is blind to its utter dependence on the bottom, the ground, and therefore is blind to it doesn't recognize its inevitable accountability to the ground. If you depend on something, then you're accountable to it because your survival depends on it. So and that particular ideology divides us, and us, the commoners, divides us, and thus disempowers the bottom or the ground or the populace, and thus is an ideology that supports entrenched power and privilege. Now I'm going to get to how this plays out in our understanding of evolution and our misunderstanding of evolution. In primitive evolutionary theory, now evolutionary theory has gotten a lot more sophisticated, although the strain does run through orthodox, but the popular crude version of evolution is that it's the survival of the fittest, and that the survivors, it's the survival of that which competes most successfully for its individual survival. It's a competition. Evolution is understood as fundamentally a competition in which what survives are those who win the competition, and those individuals get to pass on their genes, and therefore their survivors are the best competitors. Now, that's half of the truth. It's true, but it's half of the truth. And that's part of the concept of belonging that we've developed here. Belonging is both to be yourself, stand up for yourself, protect yourself, not to sacrifice yourself for, oh, I'm just, So is belonging is both to be yourself and to be respectful of your dependence and relationship and connection with the other, all others, and thus to weave yourself into the web of life. With this ideological model, in this view, and this does get into some of the orthodox evolutionary people. Well, actually, the people who have been uncovering the fact that that actually that we have evolved cooperative instincts, the people who are sort of uncovering that have had to deal with a puzzlement. You can feel it when you read their stuff that they're a little defensive. And because it's a puzzle, if that is your model, that the most competitive wins, it's puzzle how pro-social behavior survives. Why wouldn't the self-sacrificing person be left out of the gene pool and therefore not get to pass their genes on? Why would self-sacrifice that's so apparent in nature, in animals that just for one example, a bird that when someone gets near its nest runs around pretending to be injured to attract the predator away from the eggs. So, and if you have that assumption that pro-social behavior, that there isn't an ingrown, adaptive, evolved instinct for social behavior, you end up with the sort of the Hobbesian view. And I don't know if you remember, Hobbes said, life in nature is short, nasty, and cruel. Nasty, cruel, and short. Nasty, brutish, short. And that civilization is a way of creating a decent world in spite of human nature. So the basic idea is that that what civilization is a social contract is it's a transactional view of that civilization is a social contract in which, while I would really love to murder, plunder, and rape you, I don't want, and I really like murdering, plundering, and raping. That's what my natural instinct is to do. But I don't want to be murdered, plundered, and raped. So I'll make you a deal. I won't murder, plunder, and rape you if you don't plunder and rape me. And so civilization is essentially a social contract to promote decent behavior in spite of the natural antisocial human instincts. Again, that's a piece of the truth. But there's a couple of problems with that view. One is it's kind of unlikely. If you're building something against nature, I don't give it very good odds. And secondly, if you're building something against nature, you're likely to feel entitled to use very extreme means to enforce it, including burning witches and genociding savages and so forth. But the underlying assumption is that humans are not by nature social and decent. And a way that this has gotten popularized is with the notion of the selfish gene. Now, but evolution is not just an individual adaptation. Among other things, evolution is or as Darwin said, is about the origin of the species, is the evolution of a species. It's the evolution of a species. And well, so one of the people who has scientists who has clarified the source of pro-social evolutionary behavior is Blueprint, is a guy named Nicholas Christakis. He's in the reading list. And he wrote a book called Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. And it's basically about the evolution of pro-social human behavior. And the basic point is that since humans are a social animal, we evolved to adapt to our social as well as our natural environment, which means that those behaviors that promote survival of the tribe are adapted for individuals living in that tribe. So, for instance, if I'm a good hunter, that could be an asset for the tribe or not. I mean, if I don't share what I hunt, then my hunting is not an asset for the tribe, and I'm likely to be left on the ice floe. If the tribe excludes antisocial behavior or people who can't get over antisocial behavior, then my hunting skills are not going to survive. The hunting skills are going to survive if I act in a way that promotes my membership in the tribe, and therefore because it promotes the survival of the tribe, of the whole. Now, that points to a more complicated causality than atomism. And one of the functions of the basic concepts of the narcissistic point of view, since there is no general good, no common good, there's only the society is created by, and the world is created by atoms who come together. And if you want to understand how something works, the causality is from the parts to the whole, the individuals to the whole. That's why it's confusing if individuals don't act in their own interest. Why would they survive in the whole? Why would that help the whole? So atomism is that the linear causality from the parts to the whole, which also implies that if you want to understand how something, you take it apart. And as you understand the parts, you will understand the whole. But once the parts create a new whole with its own needs and qualities, those parts that are compatible with the existence of the whole on which the part depends become adaptive. So you have a circular causality where the parts cause the whole, but the whole also conditions which parts are advantaged and survive. So therefore, while individuals add up to the tribe also feeds back and promotes individuals of certain behaviors and ones that don't. Same thing with cells. For instance, a cancer cell is essentially a selfish antisocial cell, and it is non-adaptive ultimately because If it wins, then it kills the organism. So the organism has, the organism loses sometimes, but the organism has powerful tools to kill off and prevent cancer cells from replicating, cause they're antisocial. Same thing with, of course, as we're experiencing worldwide, on the planetary level, a species who doesn't, who lives in an ecological environment, that species which is compatible with the ecological environment can survive, and those which can't become good citizens of the environment will go extinct. So it's a cyclical loop of causality. Now, Christakis lists those human behaviors that he says are responsible for our success as a species, and therefore ultimately adaptive. The growth and power of human beings' influence in the world is due to what he calls a social suite of instincts that have been developed because they have promoted the survival of the species, and mostly in its tribal form. So there's other people make other lists, but his is, we have an instinct that promotes having and recognizing individual identities, individuals. And that's one. Two is that we have an instinct for attachment to individuals, particularly our mates and our children. That spreads out to an instinct for friendship. And that spreads out into an instinct for social networks. And that's part of it based on instinct for cooperation. And that's part of attachment to a group, and attachment to a group, and attachment to leadership, social structures, and social rules and social structures and leadership, and to a social learning process, social learning and teaching, social learning, so that we cumulatively know what our species has learned all the way back, which is why I don't have to invent an icebox or a refrigerator to keep my food cold. So these qualities are the instinctual base that made for the extraordinary reach and power and impact of human beings in the world, for better or for worse. Our challenge today is these instincts were adaptive for a tribal people. Our challenge is, can we adapt these instincts to apply to a we, right? It's us and them, the tribe versus them. So loyalty to the tribe is protective of the tribe. But can we adapt to applying those instincts, those affiliative instincts, to a we that's compatible with the reach of our current powers to affect the world? If you have more power, then you have more responsibility and you affect more things, more people. That's part of the maturing process. Can we adapt those instincts and apply them to a greater we, to a we that's as big as the reach of our power, which, when you consider nuclear weapons and so forth, is, and global warming, is everybody, everything. And that takes us back to the issue of cultural learning, an instinct for cultural learning, and that there's a cultural learning process. And can we transition to a paradigm, from a paradigm of narcissism to a paradigm of holism, membership, belonging, being good citizens of the whole? Can we recognize our dependence on and our accountability to the whole of humanity and nature? That's the challenge of our moment. But we have an instinctual structure to work from. We're not doing that with no instincts for how to belong. So that brings us to the discussion of the human brain and the evolution of the human brain, because among the resources that nature's evolutionary process has equipped us with to deal with our present crisis of finding our belonging on the planet and in the world is the human brain. So I'm going to talk about a oversimplified, very, very oversimplified, but nevertheless, I think instructive model of the human brain. And this is familiar probably to many of you. They're called the tripart brain, the tripart brain, and the tripart brain is an evolutionary model, and I'm going to present it in evolutionary order. So, Daniel Siegel, who wrote a book called Mind Sight, which is one of the books on the reading list, talks about the hand model of the brain. So the first part, the oldest part, is the brain stem. This is the hand. This is the brain. But the oldest part is the brain stem, and the brain stem is the reptilian brain, and it's responsible for regulating bodily functions and for survival. And it's the place where the fight, flight, or freeze instinct comes in, the instinct to run from danger. And if you can't run from danger, to fight with danger. And if you can't fight with danger, to freeze and hope it doesn't see you. Then the next thing, evolutionary aspect, is the limbic system of the brain. And that is essentially the seat of our emotional life. And that's from the mammalian, an evolution of the mammalian level of our aspect of our species. And that's the place where, like mammals, that bonds, that forms attachment. It's the seat of love, nurturance, nurturing of the young, sacrifice for the young, and also applies to bonding to the group. So this is sort of the emotional center, the limbic system of the brain, and it's basically the center of the affiliative system. I'm going to call it the affiliative system, the system of making connections and emotional connections and bonds. And then the youngest part of our brain, which wraps around, let's see if I can get my hand in the right position, and protects and guides the emotional part, is the cortex. And it's basically the executive function of the brain, the decision-making, planning function. It makes plans, it has goals, it's strategies. Make sure we remember to pay our bills and so forth. Might decide that it's worth going to some laborious training process so that we can eventually make more money or whatever. So, and of that part, the newest part is the central, is right here, is the very newest part, is the central part of the prefrontal cortex of the PFC. And it's responsible for integration of the whole, for integration of the needs of the whole. Now, as you would expect in the narcissistic model, the narcissistic model privileges what differentiates us from animals. That's part of the exceptionalism of the narcissistic model. What differentiates us from animals, and has a hierarchical view, and it basically internalizes the hierarchical view of the political system, which is as a hierarchy, and the authoritarian model, where the cortex is supposed to be running the show, the planning part, and telling the rest of the body what to feel, what it's allowed to feel, and what it's not allowed to feel. Now, depending on the relationship between the emotional and the executive function, that's problematic or not. But in the narcissistic model, in the authoritarian model, where the executive function is essentially a dictator, a privileged dictator, the executive function is dissociated from the emotional and bodily self. It's not informed by and modified by and in service to the emotional core of the self. And that's where you get, the Eichmann, right? Anna Arendt's book about Eichmann was what's the word? Anyway, the ordinariness of evil. Anyway, so she says it's not that. So Eichmann didn't hate Jews particularly, didn't have anything against Jews particularly, but he obeyed orders. And Hitler said, I want you to kill as many Jews as you possibly can. And we got a lot of Jews to kill because we just took over Eastern Europe. And my God, what do we do with them? So Eichmann took it as, and this was his defense. And when he was tried by Israel, his defense was, I was just obeying orders. It was a technical problem, and I did my job, which was to find the most efficient way to kill as many human beings as quickly and as efficiently as I could. And that included Jews, and it also included anybody who was an enemy of the fascist regime. So the detached executive function, unharnessed to the emotional instinctual core, which is the place of love and decency and connection and bonding, it can be a horror. But the highest function of the new gift of nature is, as I said, the central part of the prefrontal cortex, and its job is to integrate the whole, and therefore to replace an authoritarian leader with a servant leader, a leader who listens to and supports and serves the emotional needs and bodily needs of the whole being. So which coordinates a healthy whole, an executive function which is accountable to, responsible to, and supportive of the evolved emotional guidance and needs of the human being. And it's responsible for the health of the whole, where health is a love and acceptance and inclusion and integration of our own whole selves. Where the executive function led by the PFC has access to and can be informed by the guidance of the emotional center that evolution has built into us. Now, if we're talking about the evolution of paradigms, we're living essentially in the late stages of the Enlightenment paradigm. And as is the case with paradigms, the Enlightenment paradigm at first offered a liberation from religious dogma and freed the intellect. so that people wouldn't get burnt at the stake because they discovered something that the church decided was a heresy to discover. So it freed essentially the mind, and that was a great liberation, and that was epitomized by Descartes saying, "I think, therefore I am." That my thinking, my free ability to think, and the liberation of individual freedom to think. So, but you notice he said, "I think, therefore I am," not "I love, therefore I am," not "I breathe, therefore I am," not "I am a living organism, therefore I am," not I feel my spiritual connection with the world, therefore I am. It's a freedom of the executive function, of the mental function. And that was a great step forward. Now we're sort of experiencing the blind spots of that, which is in celebrating individual freedom, it lost taking care of a general collective. This is all great generalizations of a very complex thing, but we're experiencing now the bad side, the negatives, the cost of an individualistic view of the world, and the cost of a view of the world that privileges intellect over heart and body. And that AI is sort of the extreme of that AI is trying to learn to act like a living, caring creature and to mimic it, but basically it's only can replace human beings if we think what's important about human beings is our intellectual function. Okay, so now we live in a world that is dangerous, frightening, destructive, cruel, that involves pain and sorrow and grief, and that will ultimately dissolve us, inevitably dissolve us. So we live in a world that is dangerous, and in some way you could call that hostile. That's dangerous to us, to our existence, that threatens our existence. We also live in a world that is nurturing, generous, glorious, beautiful, miracle that makes our life possible. That is a great gift. And one calls for protecting and defending ourselves, and the other one calls for appreciating and expanding ourselves beyond our skin-tight selfhood. So we have two systems in the brain that are part of dealing with each of those aspects. So one, we've talked about the alarm system, which is the reptilian brain, the most primitive and oldest system. And that's a system of fight, flight, and freeze in the face of danger. And it's a system that has to override everything else. It has to override everything else, because when there's danger, you got to act right now. So if you hear a noise, you don't have time to say, gee, that could have been a shot. You know, that could have been aimed at me. Wow, if that was aimed at me, I should probably duck. Okay, there's no time for that. It's duck. So the alarm system overrides everything else and is designed to deal with survival emergencies. PTSD is when you're stuck in your alarm system, when you don't calibrate the alarm system, and it's always on, or it gets triggered gets triggered mistakenly, so that you feel you feel in danger when you're not. I once worked as a therapist with a veteran who, um, when he was in Vietnam, said that children were sent to bring bombs to GIs, Vietnamese children to bring bombs to GIs, hidden in a gift. Um, and and he saw that happen once. And as a result, his great fear, this guy was basically afraid to go outside because he was afraid that he would see a child and react in a violent way, that he wasn't safe for the world, for his to be home in his world because of how he might react to a child before on his immediate survival level, before the part of him that could kick in, that would say, wait a minute, you're home, you're safe, you're all right. That was then, this is now. Um, so we have a survival system that's part of our reptilian brain. And then we have, hold on a second. One metaphor for the role of the PFC in the executive function is a rider and a horse. And I mentioned that once in a previous class, that a good rider would listen to the horse because the horse knows things the rider doesn't. The horse smells things and knows where water is and and knows where it's safe to walk and so forth. So a rider who just bullies the horse and makes it do what he wants or she wants, um, is ultimately not a good sensitive rider. A rider is one who listens to and respects the fact that the horse knows things and sees things and smells things that she doesn't, that the rider doesn't. And I brought that up, and someone said, there was a member of the class was someone who'd done equestrian um, healing work with kids, with abused kids. And she said, we call that being a centaur, that a really good rider is a centaur, which is to say, is one with the horse. Ah, okay. Um, we live in a world that is dangerous, that